I'd like to welcome you to the U.S. Women's Caucus virtual event for the CSW70 entitled Resisting Regression, Gender Justice in a Changing U.S. and UN. We thank you all who have joined us for this program, as we feel this is timely to have the discussion right now, and we feel we have an expert panel who know the UN well, and have watched the evolution of policies towards the UN, towards women, and certainly the role of society at the UN over time. Just as a quick review, let me talk a little bit about what's been going on since we've had our last meeting at the CSW when we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action. Much has changed at the UN. The backlash against women's rights that the Secretary General warned us about last year is very, very real. Many governments are taking active steps to block and inhibit women's rights. But the actions against women are also being done against a backdrop of targeted actions at the same time at the UN itself. This makes the attacks so insidious and, alas, so effective. For example, the new U.S. administration has taken several major steps affecting the UN itself, as well as targeted actions affecting the rights of women directly. So let's look at a couple of these examples. Regarding the UN itself, the US has delayed payments of the UN dues and payments for UN peacekeeping operations. The US is now $4.1 billion in arrears, and although it's not alone in being behind on its payments, it is, as the major contributor to the UN, this action has already had profound effects on the UN. It is not only for reform, but also reducing staffing already by at least 20%. Now, the US has recently announced it'll be paying $2.1 billion, about half of what is owed, but it's still not clear yet when the money will be paid and exactly what the money will go for. In the meantime, the UN is struggling to survive. In addition, the U.S. announced last December that it would be withdrawing from 66 international organizations, including 33 UN-related agencies, in addition to the UN agencies that the U.S. had already withdrawn from, including UNESCO, WHO, as well as the Paris Peace Climate Treaty. At the same time, in terms of women's rights, the U.S. last fall refused to endorse the Beijing Platform for Action, as well as other previously agreed to resolutions relating to racial discrimination, discrimination against ethnic minorities, and even the SDGs. Clearly, it's no longer business as usual at the UN. In addition, the US has tried to force the UN, as well as other institutions, to eliminate any programs that relate to DEI, diversity, equity, or inclusion. It has moved to eliminate the words sexual and reproductive rights, as well as a discussion of gender from all UN documents and resolutions. Such efforts were in full display last week when the US tried to force the CSW70 to agree to major modifications to the agreed conclusions and for the first time forced a vote on it. The US was the only one to vote against the agreed conclusions, and luckily it was soundly defeated at that time. Now, lots of things are going on certainly right now. You've got the money crisis, you've got the reform crisis, you have the Secretary General, which is going to be selected soon, and all of this is going on at the same time. So let's turn to our panel today to talk about what's happening behind the scenes at the UN and how women in particular and programs for women are being affected. Let me begin with Pamela Morgan, who is the co-chair of the NGO CSW New York and the Committee on UN Chair for Zonta International, which is in Bangkok, Geneva, Paris, and Vienna. Pamela is a tireless worker and an activist dedicated to uplifting the status of women. Pamela serves as the executive committee of the NGO CSW in New York and the NGO Committee on Migration. A retired instructional technologist, she is also the founder and executive director of Women Media Network that educates the public about global issues facing women using film, video, and new media as platforms. I can think of no better person who could kick this discussion off than Pamela. So, Pamela, I will send it over to you.
Thank you, Pam, and thank you to the U.S. Women's Caucus for this invitation. And I don't think that it's any surprise to anyone that CSW70 finds us at a moment of profound crisis for gender justice, both in the U.S. as well as globally. The ground that we thought was settled is shifting. Rights we thought were secure are not. They're being reversed. And this is not a gross exaggeration. This is documented reality. And we must name it clearly, understand it deeply, and resist it strategically. Next slide, please. So the reality of regression, what's happening now in the U.S. We've witnessed the overturning of Roe versus Wade, ending nearly 50 years of constitutional protection for abortion rights. At least 14 states have near total abortion bans. Women are being denied life-saving medical care. Doctors are facing criminal prosecution for providing health care. And this is just the beginning. Efforts are underway to restrict access to contraception, ban abortion pills nationwide, and criminalize traveling across state lines to access reproductive care. But the assault on bodily autonomy extends beyond reproductive rights. We see state legislators criminalizing gender-affirming care for transgender youth and adults. We see bans on discussing LGBTQI identities in schools. We see books that acknowledge LGBTQI people exist by removing those books from libraries. And this is really about controlling bodies, policing gender, and denying people the fundamental right to make decisions about their own lives. The economic dimensions of this regression is equally devastating. Women, particularly Black and brown women, have experienced catastrophic job losses. During the pandemic and its aftermath, women of color were disproportionately concentrated in sectors hardest hit: healthcare, education, hospitality, and service work. They were laid off at higher rates, brought back at slower rates, and now face an economy where the jobs that have returned often paid less and offer fewer protections than before. Black women's unemployment rates remain persistently higher than those of white women and white men. Latina women face wage gaps that mean they earn 57 cents for every dollar earned by white men. Economic insecurity isn't just a policy failure. It's a barrier to justice. When women cannot afford childcare, housing, or health care, they cannot escape abusive relationships, pursue education, organize for their rights, or participate fully in civic life. Please, next slide. So what's happening at the UN and on the global stage? At the UN, we see parallel dynamics. Agreed language on sexual and reproductive health and rights is contested in every negotiation. And as Pam noted, the term gender itself is questioned. References to gender ideology are weaponized to undermine decades of consensus. Member states that once championed women's rights now vote to weaken protections, or they remain silent when rights are attacked. In fact, after the U.S. government broke a 70-year tradition of consensus and called for a vote on CSW draft agree conclusions, by the way, a move that failed, they then introduced a draft resolution on protection of women and girls through appropriate terminology, stating that the word gender refers to men and women only. Countries are withdrawing from critical international commitments. Turkey withdrew from the Istanbul Convention, the world's most comprehensive treaty on preventing and contracting violence against women in 2021, claiming it was incompatible with traditional family values. Poland's Constitutional Tribunal ruled aspects of the convention unconstitutional. Hungary has refused to ratify it. These are not isolated decisions. They're part of coordinated efforts to roll back legal protections for women. We also see countries pulling back from CEDAW commitments. While states may not formally withdraw, they issue reservations that hollow out their obligations, delay reporting, ignore recommendations from the CEDAW committee, and fail to implement domestic legislation that would give the convention force. And we know that the consequences are dire. Gender-based violence is rising globally. UN Women reports that before the pandemic, 1 in 3 women experienced physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. That rate has increased. Intimate partner violence has surged, being called a shadow pandemic, as lockdowns trapped women with abusers while services shut down. Femicide rates are climbing in multiple regions. Online gender-based violence has exploded. And what's happening is women are facing harassment online, threats, doxing, and abuse that drives them out of public spaces, both physical and digital. Economic decline compounds these crises. When economies contract, women lose their jobs first and regain them last. They're pushed into informal work without protections. They're denied education as families prioritize boys' education during resource scarcity. They become more vulnerable to trafficking, forced marriage, and survival sex work. They also face increased unpaid care work as public services are cut and family members need support. The education crisis is particularly acute. UNESCO estimates that 11 million girls may never return to school. When girls lack education, they face early marriage, early pregnancy, limited economic opportunities, and exclusion from decision-making throughout their lives. Education isn't just a right, it's infrastructure for gender justice. Next slide, please. So now we're going to look at how regression operates. We know it's not random. We know it's strategic, coordinated, and well-resourced. So first we have patriarchal structures that are reasserting control. And at the core of this backlash is patriarchy. Systems of male dominance that allocate power, resources, and decision-making authority primarily to men, while subordinating women and anyone who doesn't conform to rigid gender norms. And we know that patriarchy is as dangerous for men, most men, as it is for women. We also look at legal and policy rollbacks. Patriarchal power operates through formal mechanisms, legislatures, courts, executive orders, to dismantle protections and criminalize resistance. We see this in abortion bans, withdrawal from international conventions, defunding of gender equality programs, and laws criminalizing LGBTQI plus identities in over 60 countries. Then we look at economic extraction and deprivation. We know that women's economic insecurity is not accidental, it's structural. Wage gaps, occupational segregation, undervaluation of care work, exclusion from property and inheritance rights, and lack of social safety nets all function to keep women economically vulnerable and therefore easier to control. When combined with job losses, particularly for Black and brown women, this creates conditions where survival trumps resistance, where women must accept exploitative conditions because alternatives don't exist. We have violence as enforcement. And we know that gender-based violence isn't something in someone's imagination. It's how patriarchy enforces compliance. When women step out of prescribed roles, violence reminds them of their place. Rising rates of intimate partner violence, femicide, and online abuse function to intimidate women back into subordinate positions. And then we have the shrinking civic space and silencing dissent. And across regions, governments are using laws against foreign funding, restrictions on NGO activities, and criminalization of protests to make it harder and more dangerous for women's rights defenders to organize, advocate, and hold power accountable. Women human rights defenders face assassination, imprisonment, surveillance, and smear campaigns designed to delegitimize their work and silence their voices. And recently in the news, we saw a case in the mid-Atlantic states where a human rights defender was actually killed, and that was recent. So there is a lot that we are dealing with when looking at how regression operates. Next slide, please. Now, amid this, regression is a small glimmer of hope, and it's important to acknowledge the efforts to push back that UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has designed. And it's a program, the Gender Equality Acceleration Program, often referred to as the GEAP, and the broader push for women's full participation in the peace process, humanitarian response, and climate action. And it is an imperfect situation. We know we've all heard over the last week and a half women talk about 1325 being words on paper because they're not being heard. But the Secretary General is putting forth an effort to use these tools to give women gender equality and support. He has also championed women's participation in the peace process, recognizing that peace agreements negotiated without women are less likely to last. His advocacy for the Women, Peace, and Security agenda has helped maintain visibility for women's essential roles in conflict prevention and resolution, even as implementation remains woefully inadequate. But, and this is critical, institutional commitments from leadership, while important, are really insufficient when member states actively undermine gender equality. The Secretary General can advocate, but he cannot compel states to fund UN Women adequately, implement CEDAW, or stop withdrawing from the Istanbul Convention. And this really reveals a fundamental tension. Multilateral institutions can establish norms and provide platforms, but they cannot override state sovereignty. When states choose regression, even the most committed UN leadership has limited power to stop them. This is why civil society is so important, because as civil society, we can put pressure on member states, not just on the UN leadership, but we can put essential pressure on member states because we cannot rely on institutions alone. Next slide, please. So why this moment matters? Because we are in an intersecting crisis. And some might ask, backlash is nothing new. Women have always had to fight. Why is this moment different? This moment matters because the scale, coordination, and acceleration of regression threatens to undo decades of progress. It matters because democratic institutions, including the UN multilateral system, are weakening precisely when we need them most. It matters because climate crisis, conflict, and economic instability create conditions where authoritarianism thrives and marginalized people are scapegoated. It matters because intersectional crises pandemic, economic collapse, climate emergency, conflict, compound vulnerability for women, particularly those facing racism, poverty, disability, and displacement. And it matters because who we are in moments of regression defines what comes next. Next slide, please. So let's look at some strategies for resistance. We have to speak boldly. We have to name what is happening. We have to call out these coordinated attacks on women's rights, bodily autonomy, and gender justice. We cannot sugarcoat it, calling them policy disagreements. We have to not be concerned about using controversial language that is going to get someone upset. But we have to be very deliberate in looking at the rollbacks of fundamental rights. And we must name patriarchy as the system that we're fighting. We're not fighting individual bad actors. We're not fighting a president or a emperor or a king. We are fighting a system, the structures for which allocate power based on gender, that use violence, law, and economics to maintain that allocation. Clarity matters. We can't use vague language. We have to be very specific. And then we have to center bodily autonomy as foundational. The right to make decisions about our own bodies, whether to continue a pregnancy, access contraception, receive gender-affirming care, marry who we choose, engage in sex work, refuse sex within marriage. That's fundamental to all rights. Without bodily autonomy, there is no meaningful freedom. We must defend it and resist efforts to carve out exceptions or create hierarchies where some people's bodily autonomy is protected, and others is not or is denied. Next, we look at addressing economic justice as gender justice. We cannot achieve gender equality while women face systemic economic exclusion. This means fighting for living wages and pay equity, universal child care and paid family leave, social safety nets that don't punish women for leaving abusive partners, access to education and skills training, protection for workers in informal economies, and debt relief and economic policies that don't disproportionately harm women. Next, we look at the building of cross-movement solidarity. The attacks on gender equality are interconnected with attacks on racial justice, LGBTQI rights, immigrant rights, labor rights, and environmental justice. Our resistance must be equally interconnected, and we must be kind, and we must be patient and tolerant, and embrace our comrades in the fight and not find reasons to discredit people. We must reject efforts to divide movements, to pit reproductive rights advocates against trans rights advocates, or economic justice organizers against climate activists. Our struggles are linked. Our power comes from solidarity, not from fragmentation. Then we look at defending the international human rights frameworks. And even as we critique the limitations, we must defend frameworks like CEDAW, the Istanbul Convention, and the Beijing Platform. These are tools that movements fought for and can be leveraged for accountability. I advise you to pay close attention to the work that is being done on the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, which was introduced in January of this year, and it's to be adopted in 2030. When states withdraw or weaken commitments, civil society must document violations, submit shadow reports, use treaty monitoring bodies, and create public accountability that has political cost for regression. Then we have supporting women's human rights defenders, women who are on the front lines, particularly in contexts where they face violence, imprisonment, and assassination. They need resources, protection, and solidarity. This means funding their organizations, amplifying their voices, providing emergency support when they're attacked, and ensuring that international attention protects them rather than putting them at greater risk. We must continue to challenge patriarchal power directly. We must be willing to name and challenge patriarchal structures in our organizations, our movements, our families, our governments, and international institutions. This means confronting men who hold power and expect deference. It means refusing to center male comfort over women's safety. It means building institutions and movements where power is shared, where care work is valued, and where leadership doesn't require performing dominance. We must invest in education, especially for girls, because we know that ensuring girls can access education is one of the most powerful interventions for gender justice. Educated girls marry later, have fewer children, earn more income, participate more in civic life, and are better able to claim their votes. This means fighting for free, quality, and accessible education and challenging cultural and economic barriers that keep girls out of school. We must document, expose, and create accountability, and we must rigorously document rollbacks, expose connections between anti-gender actors, and create accountability mechanisms that have consequences. And number 10, we're going to tell different stories and reclaim narrative power. The right has been effective at storytelling. Narratives about protecting children, preserving families, defending tradition. These stories tap into genuine concerns even as they advance harmful agendas. We need equally compelling stories about bodily autonomy as dignity, gender equality, creating thriving communities, LGBTQI people as beloved family members, and the world we're all building together. And we must amplify people telling their stories, survivors, organizers, young people, rather than having experts speak for them. They have to have their own voice. Next slide, please. So we have an opportunity within the crisis. And I want to acknowledge that something that may seem contradictory, moments of repression and regression often create opportunities. Backlash clarifies who stands for justice and who doesn't. It forces movements to get sharper, stronger, more strategic, more unified. Some of the most powerful organizing in history emerge from periods of intense oppression. This doesn't mean that regression is good. It means that those who came before us faced worse and still built movements powerful enough to win. And we carry that legacy. At the UN, we have decades of agreed language, international legal frameworks, and civil society infrastructures built by generations of feminist activists. We have the Secretary General using his platform to champion gender equality. We have treaty monitoring bodies, special rapporteurs, and accountability mechanisms. Imperfect for sure, but real. In the US and globally, we have movements that have been organizing for centuries, building power in communities, and creating alternatives to systems that fail us. So this question isn't whether we have tools to resist. The question is whether we will use them with the courage and coordination that this moment demands. Next slide, please. So our responsibility to everyone here. If you work in the UN system, use your position to protect gender equality, language, amplify grassroots voices, and hold member states accountable, even when it's uncomfortable. Push for adequate funding for UN Women and gender equality program, and ensure that the Secretary General's commitments translate to action across the system. If you lead organizations, resource feminist movements generously and without conditions. create pathways for women from marginalized communities to lead, build organizational cultures where care work is valued and burnout is addressed structurally, not individually. If you control funding, give multi-year unrestricted grants to the boldest, most grassroots connected organizations. Multi-year grants are important. Excuse me. Fund women of color-led organizations at the same rate as others and support women's human rights defenders facing threats. And if you are an advocate, organizer, or activist, build your coalitions across movements. Tell stories that move people to action. Refuse to let regression go unchallenged in any space you occupy. All of us can refuse to accept regression as inevitable. We can reject despair. We can choose solidarity over division. We can choose courage over compliance. And we can choose collective action over individualism. So, next slide, please. So, the closing question is, what will you do? What will be the movements that you put forward to make a difference in the lives of women for gender justice? How will you help to fight? What will be your means of resistance? I once heard Sonia Sanchez, who is a famous poet, and she had a one-word poem. And she said the word resist with different intonations, with different feelings, and she just said the word resist in many different ways for about 5 minutes. And that is what I encourage all of us to do. Whatever resist means to you, I encourage you to internalize it and be ready to be courageous and to resist. Thank you.
Okay, well, that was a fantastic call to action. Pamela, you have given us a 10-point plan and plenty of ways that each of us, in each of our own way, can get involved. I think you touched upon so many different topics there. It's very comprehensive comments that you've made. So I'm very grateful for your time this morning. I look forward to again working with you on these things. Now, I'm going to then move on though to our next speaker, Damilola Banjo. Damilola Banjo is an award-winning staff reporter for PassBlue. She has covered a wide range of topics from Africa-centered stories to gender equality at the UN peacekeeping and U.S. and UN relations. She also oversees all video productions for PassBlue. She was a Dag Hammarskjöld Fellow in 2023 and a Pulitzer Center postgraduate fellow in 2021. She was part of the BBC Africa team that produced an Emmy-nominated documentary, Sex for Grades. In addition, she worked for WFAE, an NPR affiliate in Charlotte, North Carolina. She has a Master of Science degree from Columbia University School of Journalism and an undergraduate degree from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. She has been a point person from PassBlue for writing about what's been going on behind the scenes at the UN, and particularly on the UN issues. She has, you probably saw her editorial last week, or her story last week, about the machinations that went on with the U.S. trying to modify the agreed conclusions last week. So I will turn the floor over to Ms. Banjo.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pam, for the introduction and for inviting me to speak on this panel, very important one. Also, Pamela, that was very comprehensive and yes, detailed presentation there. Thank you so much. My name is Damilola, and I want to start my presentation on an assumption, and please correct me if I'm wrong. Funding for gender programs has never in any time in history been surplus. But I don't want to get us into history lessons. So I'm going to start from the evening of February 26, 2025. That was the night UNFPA received the message that 48 of its programs funded by USAID and US State Department have been terminated, just like that, gone. Um, we watched in real time the dismantling of the largest donor agency in the world. In a matter of weeks, we saw over 1,000 health facilities and mobile health teams shut down. We saw more than 250 safe spaces for women and girls forced to close. All of this in about a week of the process to dismantle USAID. We saw the end of maternal care, rape treatment, protection services, and just all sort of life-saving intervention for women and girls in some of the most vulnerable countries and conflict zones around the world. But I don't want to dwell on funding cuts. Pam, when she gave the introductory remark, has mentioned some of this impact. And we've also had Pamela, lists the effects on women, girls, and just everyone in the gender continuum. What I want to talk to you about today is what I have had to report in the last 14 months since power changed hands in Washington. We have seen gender language being rewritten, and it's been very deliberate. In mandate renewals, after mandate renewal at the Security Council, we've seen gender provision disappear. Referencing to gender equality is just gone. Gender sensitivity and gender considerations deleted in most mandates renewal in the last 14 months. The UNIFIL, the peacekeeping in Lebanon, mandate renewal adopted in August 2025, contained no mention of WPS language whatsoever. Need I say that in the previous mandate document, there were robust language on WPS, but all of that deleted in the mandate renewal. I think for me, what seemed to be uh, uh, surprising and to some extent remarkable, really, is the relationship between the US and Russia. These are two countries that once upon a time almost never agreed on anything. And we've seen them, align along the same team. The two countries co-authored a presidential statement on Syria with no reference to gender. This about a country with documented systemic targeting of women throughout more than a decade of conflicts in that country. Earlier this year, the women's participation provision in the 80 Special Political Mission were killed during mandate renewal negotiation. And as Pam and Pamela have said, also, we've seen this week how Washington vigorously pushed to delete important gender language from the agreed conclusion. They did not succeed, thankfully, but the fact that we are renegotiating and relitigating previously agreed languages just tells you everything about, where we had today. And here's something one of the diplomats told me during an interview. He said, making concessions on gender provision is now the price to pay to get a whole mandate through. Let me say that again. Diplomats are having to they're having to sacrifice gender protection to save an entire resolution from collapse. This is the situation we're in right now. when gender expertise is removed from a panel of experts and replaced with the narrow category of conflict-related sexual violence. It reduces the range of violations that can be documented. And I'll give you an example of some of the nuanced issue we lose when this language is reduced or narrowed down or explicitly just expunged from document. Economic violence against women, exclusion of women from post-conflict reconstruction processes, gender discriminatory laws enacted under the cover of armed conflict. None of these issues fit perfectly within the category of conflict-related sexual violence. And these are some of the nuanced issues that we're losing because of the actions that we're seeing in the Security Council. When the Council replaced gender equality for equality between women and men, it is narrowing the protection for minority groups in ways that have legal consequences. If we dilute the language, we inadvertently dilute the law. The deletion of gender language from resolutions and the defunding of gender program mutually reinforce each other. When gender language is removed from a mandate, it becomes easier to justify not funding a gender advisor. When a peacekeeping operations mandate no longer robustly requires women's participation to be facilitated, it becomes easier to cut spaces for women and girls, as we have seen happening just with the defunding of USAID, the dismantling of USAID and funding cuts, that we have seen, US withholding assets contribution, and all of the way that UN agencies and gender program have been starved of funding in the last, again, 14 months. I think the question we're all trying to answer is whether the international system still see, and by seeing, I mean still protect women and girls that it was built to serve. That, I think, to me, is what this is about. It's not about the grammar, not even sometimes the diplomatic processes. And while I know that in the last maybe 5 or 6 minutes that I've been speaking, it seemed like it's been problems. And maybe I've also inadvertently painted a hopeless situation. This is not the aim, but we do need to see how both funding cuts and retrogressing gender language in mandates, resolution, and just any UN document are systematically chipping away 30 years of gain. Nonetheless, I like to believe that there is resistance in the system. The agreed conclusion at the start of this year's CSW passed by a majority, and that's wonderful. A consensus would have been great. It would have been reassuring to have that 70 years tradition continue. But we see that majority of countries are still behind progressive agenda. Progressive agenda still has majority support. Even though we're really to get in previously agreed languages. I've reported across UN committees and the US efforts to cut language, gender language, DEI, climate change, sustainable development, all of this across several committee negotiations and documents. And we've seen increase in the United States calling for votes on issues and mandates and resolutions that were traditionally just adopted by consensus. But what has been very clear in every of this move by the United States is the resistance that's coming from majority of the countries. Yes, I do agree that it seemed like, and maybe not the seemingness of it, it actually true that the US has enormous power and enormous influence. But when you look at these votes and you see who is lining up behind the United States, they are few and far behind. And so I think that the system and the majority of people in the world still support progressive agenda. So perhaps for me, the silver lining here is that we have more forces pushing us forward than the ones trying to pull us down. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you ended on a positive note because there was so much bad news that's coming down the street. I like to hear it, and I think that reinforces what Pamela was saying before, which is the key word is still resist. And perhaps this needs to be repeated and repeated and repeated again. The resistance is there, even though it's a lot of bad news, that's for sure. Anyway, thank you very much for that presentation. Let's move on to Lopa Banerjee, who is our next speaker. Most of you know Lopa, but for those who don't, let me give you her background. Lopa Banerjee is the director of the Civil Society Division of UN Women and a global leader in gender equality, human rights, and civil society engagement, with more than 3 decades of experience across Africa, Asia, Middle East, and North America. She's widely recognized for her strategic vision, political insight, and sustained partnership with feminist and social justice actors worldwide. At UN Women, Lopa leads the organization's global engagement with civil society, gender equality advocates, youth networks, and grassroots movements, shaping how feminist voices influence the multilateral policy, accountability frameworks, and global decision-making. Her work focuses on expanding civic space, strengthening intergenerational and cross-movement alliances, and ensuring the community-based activism meaningfully informs the global norms and outcomes. She played a central role in conceptualizing and leading the Generation Equality Forum in 2021, a landmark global initiative that mobilized governments, civil society, philanthropy, and the private sector to accelerate the large-scale commitments and action for gender equality worldwide. Prior to joining UN Women, Lopa held senior positions across the UN system at UNDP, OHCHR, and UNICEF, working in South Africa, Iran, and Bangladesh on gender equality, human rights, governance, and advocacy. Earlier in her career, she spent 15 years in India, private sector, leading strategic communications, media, research initiatives that shape public discourse and her public influence. Lopa, I will send the floor to you. Again, you're in a key position, a central position today. I hope that you'll give us some of your views on all of these crazy things that are happening at the same time. The floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much, Pam. And thank you so much to Pamela and to you, Damilola. We all of us read your columns with great interest. Thank you so much. And thank you to the US Women's Caucus for convening this conversation at such a consequential moment. Let me begin very simply. We are not just facing a backlash against women's rights. We are witnessing a reordering of power, one that is testing the durability of the entire human rights system. And that is why this conversation matters. Because the question before us is not only what is happening, it is what kind of a world is being constructed and who is being written out of it. As we heard earlier, backlash is not new. It has followed every gain, every expansion of rights, every shift in power. But what we are seeing today is different. It is not isolated. It is a transnational political enterprise. It is not restricted only to 1 or 2 countries. Three shifts define backlash today. First, backlash actors moved into global governance spaces, including the United Nations, but not only, and determined to rewrite norms from within these global institutions. Second, they aligned with authoritarian and illiberal politics. They speak the language of democracy while hollowing out its substance. Third, they institutionalized their project. Gender became a political weapon. This is what Damilola was saying just earlier. Gender became a way to define citizenship, to enforce conformity and police dissent, a way to redraw the boundaries of the nation and consolidate state power. This backlash does not attack individual rights alone. It attacks the principle that rights belong to everyone. It normalizes the politics of exclusion. Across countries, the same patterns are visible. Control over women's bodies reframed as protection of family values. Attacks on LGBTIQ+ communities justified as public morality. Women human rights defenders treated as threats to national security. Digital spaces amplifying misogyny because outrage is profitable. And at the multilateral level, something even more fundamental, an attempt to erase not just commitments, but the very language of equality itself. Let's be clear, this is not about words. This is about dismantling the architecture that makes rights enforceable. Now, layer onto this a second reality. Severe funding contractions across the UN system and across civil society. The effect is immediate and concrete all over the world, not only by one country, but government after government after government. Services for women and girls are shrinking, organizations are struggling to survive, and the accountability ecosystem that sustains rights is being hollowed out. So we are not facing a single crisis. We are facing a convergence where political backlash and financial contraction meet, and together they drive the systemic weakening of gender equality. To understand this moment, we must abandon the idea that domestic and global politics operate separately. They do not. They are deeply entwined. We are operating in a geopolitical environment that is no longer anchored in shared norms, but increasingly in transactional interests. And in that environment, gender equality becomes useful when convenient, expendable when costly, and threatening when transformative. So we see contradictions that no longer surprise us, but should very much alarm us. Governments defending rights abroad and in the UN while restricting them at home. States negotiating peace abroad and in UN forums while criminalizing dissent domestically. Gender language traded away in one forum to gain leverage in another. This is not inconsistency. This is political calculation. And it has consequences. Because the multilateral system, however imperfect, provides something essential: a shared normative infrastructure. It gives civil society language, standards, and mechanisms to hold power to account. And when that infrastructure weakens, rights do not disappear overnight. They become harder to claim, easier to erode, and more unevenly applied. And yet, and this matters, we are not without agency. We have heard about this before. At CSW70, for the first time, the agreed conclusions were adopted by vote. And in that moment, a majority of states chose to say clearly, women's rights are not negotiable. This matters because it reminds us that even in a fractured system, coalition, persistence, and political courage can still shape outcomes. And this is the contradiction we must confront. On one side, a global order sliding toward impunity and transactionalism. On the other, a feminist multilateralism that continues to fight for norms, rights, and accountability, even when the cost is high. So, what must be done? If we are serious about defending rights, we must abandon the simplistic binaries of pro-rights and anti-rights. The real terrain is governed by incentives and interests. So we must ask, who gains from selective backlash? What incentives influence global positions versus domestic ones? How do race, migration, and economic interest intersect to shape whose rights are defended and whose are traded away? What political interests reinforce backlash, and what alliances can dismantle it? Impactful strategies must be movement-informed, context-specific, politically sharp, and grounded in power analysis. Let me be direct. This is not a moment for general commitments. It is a moment for political strategy and strategic action. So to all of you who are civil society and who work with us, I want to say 3 things. First, for governments. Governments must stop treating gender equality as a flexible negotiating position. It is not. It is a legal and political obligation. This means defending normative language in multilateral spaces, aligning domestic policy with international commitments, and resisting the quiet erosion of rights through compromise. Because credibility is now a central political currency, and it is being tested. Second, to donors. Donors must recognize that this is not a funding gap. It is a systemic risk to democratic resilience. If feminist movements are underfunded, accountability weakens. If accountability weakens, rights erode. So the response must be commensurate. Long-term, flexible core funding. Investment in movement infrastructure, not just projects. And a recognition that sustaining feminist organizing is not optional, it is foundational. Third, to all of you, civil society and feminist movements. And here I must be equally clear. Feminist movements are not peripheral to this moment. They are defining it. Across countries, they are holding the line on rights, reframing justice through intersectional realities, and building alternative visions of power, grounded in care, solidarity, and accountability. In many ways, they now carry greater moral clarity than institutions themselves. And that exposes a gap between formal authority and moral legitimacy. Closing that gap requires more than inclusion. It requires power sharing. It requires recognizing feminist movements not only as stakeholders, but as co-authors of the global agenda. Let me end here. There is a temptation in moments like this to describe what we are witnessing as decline. But that is only part of the story. Because alongside backlash, we are also witnessing something else: persistence, resistance, reimagination. People who continue to act as though collective responsibility still matters. Public servants who continue to work within compromised systems and refuse to give up on them. Activists who continue organizing without any guarantee of success. Movements that continue articulating visions of justice when the political winds are against them. Feminists who are quietly and not so quietly redesigning political possibility. And history is very clear on this. Progress on gender equality has never been granted. It has always been forced into existence. The UN is strongest and most legitimate when those most affected by inequality help to set the agenda and define the solutions. So the question is not whether backlash exists. We know it does. The question is, will we meet it with equal political will and deeper imagination? Because pushing forward is not about optimism. It is about power, it is about choice, and it is about whether we are prepared to insist that rights are not negotiable anywhere for anyone. If we are, then even this moment of fracture can become a turning point, a time when we choose deliberately to widen the circle of whose lives, whose bodies, and whose futures are protected by our institutions. And if we hesitate, we should remember this. History does not wait for certainty. It moves with those who are willing to act. Let that be the measure of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lopa. You have given us again a call to action and again some positive words that we need to steel ourselves for the fight ahead. The backlash can only be defeated by equal pressure going on the other side. Okay, I'm sure we have some questions. Let's see, would people like to go ahead and raise their hands? We'll take some questions that way first. Not able to see all of the questions. Anybody raising their hand? Okay. Well,
yes, we have three
okay.
raising their hand.
Okay, Renee, you may want to call on them because I can't see all the screens.
Shayla is the first one on my screen.
Okay, Shayla.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Renee. And thank you to all speakers, and thank you particularly to Lopa for that impassioned presentation and messaging. Thank you for that. Two questions. One is that of how the global and the national, local are intersecting. For many civil or some civil society organizations, they're continuing to see it as separate, seeing what happens globally or what happens at the UN should, to coin a phrase, stay in the UN. It does not impact the civil service aspect. That's one question. We need to address that. And the other question is that of reaching decision makers. We all know the ways, the many ways of reaching decision makers, legislators, senators, assemblymen, whoever the leaders are in whichever sector. But at this time, that wall has become very hard to scale. It's become a barrier. So if you can address those two questions, because as you say, we need to move to action, and many of us are, as am I. So I would really appreciate responses to that. Thank you. I'm Shaila Ra Mistry. I'm Vice President of U.S. Women's Caucus, CEO, founder of STEM Institute, and Aerospace Medical Device Entity, amongst other things.
Okay. Lopa, you want to take that?
Sure, sure. Thank you very much, Sheila. As I said very clearly, in terms of the global to local, all of you know this. The United Nations is a parliament of member states, which means national governments, right? And what is reflected at the UN is what are national positions in many cases. And this is why I said what I said, which is that we are talking today about backlash within and the ways in which we are seeing politics play out at the global level, at the United Nations. But this is politics that is happening at the local and national levels. And that is what is being reflected at the global level. This is number one. Number two is the United Nations has always been a space where negotiations and diplomatic relations between nations play out in terms of decision making. Now, we were at a time in the past when there was an understanding around the charter and a shared set of global governance, the idea of global governance. That is what is today changed to much, much more bilateral, transactional relations between nations rather than value-based governance, global governance norms. And that is what is playing out. So it is absolutely crucial to understand that what the politics are at the national level is in many ways what the politics will be at the global level, even when countries are different at a national and global level. So let me explain. Country A, which on the global stage is, say, upholding normative standards at its national level because of political conditions, is cracking down on dissent. And there are many countries which are doing that. Now, so yes, it is upholding norms at the global level, but because it is cracking down on dissent and therefore not necessarily upholding those same global norms domestically, at the global level, its resilience to holding those global norms will be defined by what its transactions are at the national level in terms of its bilateral relations. And it is crucial for activists and civil society to understand that. That is what I meant by selective backlash. It is not uniform. Not everybody is not defending everything. Everybody is not resisting everything. Countries are resisting some things and not other things. One country will support one aspect of gender equality and will push back on another aspect. And so you need to look at what the threads are about what it is trading off and what it is accepting based on national politics and geopolitical bargaining, geopolitical transactions. And reaching decision makers. Shaila, if you're talking about this at the global level within the UN, let me talk about that and then I'll get to the national level. At the global level at the UN, member states now in different ways are actually, even if they are not doing so formally, have actually opened the space for for outreach from civil society on a one-on-one or in small groups, because member states, many of them are also struggling with this new reality. So they are turning to civil society for language, for politics, for insight. So while it is not through formal channels, there is a lot more kind of porousness between member states and civil society in terms of how civil society, and we are seeing this right now. We are seeing it in the hallways, in the corridors, and so on. There is a lot more kind of reaching out and engagement around this at the country level. I say this over and over again. Every civil society activist is a voter. Political parties put gender equality in their political manifestos because they look for votes. That ability to exercise that vote and therefore use a voting constituency to leverage power is very important, and it has been done effectively in different countries. And I think this is where strategies become so important. At the national level, to be able to use at the local level, at the community level, to be able to use the constituency as a voting public, knowing that in a democracy this will come around. It comes around in cycles, and they will come to the voter, they will come to women for their vote. And again, it is transactional. So for women's rights groups and civil society, it is necessary to also become strategic about how to be instrumental in terms of how to use voice and vote at different points in time that are politically expedient. Okay. There is no immorality in being politically expedient. It is strategic, and it is necessary.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Susan?
Yes, thank you to all of our speakers. I'm Susan Lee, the past president of the U.S. Women's Caucus. I'm also with Sociologists for Women in Society. So really appreciated your strong talks and your calls to action. My question is primarily for Pamela Morgan. Pamela, you mentioned the need for collaboration among civil society groups, and certainly that's implied also by what the other speakers said. We're the U.S. Women's Caucus, so we think about what's going on here in the U.S. And I believe I see lots of women's organizations in the U.S., lots and lots of active women's organizations across our 50 states. But there's really a lot of fragmentation among those organizations. And I wonder if you have ideas or suggestions about how those, fragmented women's organizations in the U.S. might come together.
Pamela, are you still on the line? I know that Pamela had said that she may have to leave early, so we may have to come back on that question. Let's see if she comes back on, but otherwise, let's go to the next question in the meantime.
Mary Rose.
Hello there. Thank you so much for this conversation. I really am honing in on what happens at the local level, because that's where action takes place. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So I want to highlight that California continues to be one of the most proactive states in the U.S., focusing on access to health care, economic equality, all from the gender perspective. And this year in 2026, Governor Newsom had expanded legal protections, signed orders and legislation expanding legal protections for survivors of sexual violence and trafficking, and is addressing digital exploitation and emerging forms of abuse. So I am trying to find out how the rest of the U.S. can actually move forward what California has done. There is a whole host of strategic laws and legislation that are already in place that have been actively used. And somehow they're not highlighted. We are one of the most strategic states in the U.S. working not only on gender issues, safety and justice, but also on environmental justice and gender justice for climate change. So I'm wondering how this can be ramped up into a broader movement to use these legislative laws that are already in place and have been working, some of them for many years now. Thank you.
Lopa, you want to try that?
Yeah, I thank you. Thank you so much, Mary Rose, and very important. And I'll also try and respond to the earlier question, to Susan's question earlier, just in terms of some thoughts. Mary Rose, absolutely. This is why local action is so important, right? Learning from the various spaces. You're talking about California, and California has also, since when the United States has moved away from global stages such as climate conferences and other spaces, California has come in and represent in some of these spaces and shared this. There's also the example of Cities for CEDAW, although the United States has, as a national government, not adopted, not ratified CEDAW. There are plenty of cities that have taken on, that have ratified CEDAW at a city level, at a local level, and have taken on the provisions and then use that to improve city services. I think this is where this whole point around local action being so critical. But there's also the issue of a very deliberate, ignoring of the kinds of local action and local and state level provisions that then are not in keeping with a certain administration or its views. So once again, this goes back to the point around mobilizing and expanding that knowledge. How does this get to other again, local to local. So from one state to another state, and from another state to a third state, to strengthen that local to local continuously expansion till a point in time when it begins to start affecting national politics. Again, this is not only, I know you're speaking specifically of the United States and California, but again, this is a playbook for many other different countries where equally, similarly, national governments are in a different position from some state governments there. And again, this is the US caucus, but I think it's really important to look at lessons from other countries which have gone through a similar situation. We have countries in Latin America which have gone through years of dictatorships. How did those countries, mobilize at different points in time at the local level in different ways in order to get to a point where you then look through electoral processes to overturn that? So there are different ways in which learning can take place, and that importance of global. And to your point, Susan, I think that you're right. Fragmentation is true for everywhere. In many ways, the fragmentation is also because of the funding issues and funding constraints and so on. But we talk about from UN Women and indeed from many parts of the feminist movement, this importance of intersectionality, intersectional collaboration and intersection, because ultimately we are talking about the comprehensiveness of the human rights architecture. And so the comprehensiveness of rights. And so, I think Pamela spoke earlier about the importance of labor justice to reproductive justice to political, participation to participation to ending violence. So these are interconnected. And I think there is some work required among movements and among civil society and women's rights groups and women's groups to be looking at that kind of intersectional places where we can align and collaborate. And everybody will not obviously agree on everything. But this is a moment when you say what you will agree on and can work together on. And then there will be other spaces which will require their individual advocacy.
Thank you, Lopa.
Marie Claude, you still have a question?
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm very happy to be in this session. And I thank my colleague who just flagged it out to me because I was not aware of it. I'm happy also to listen to Lopa, whom I met a few years ago in Paris. I'm the main representative to UNESCO of the International Federation of Business and Professional Women. I'm also past chair of the UNESCO, of the ICNGO at UNESCO and NGO Liaison Committee, and I was several times elected. So I have a question on the movement of the feminist diplomacy. I don't know if you have attended the side event of Spain, but the next country to host the feminist diplomacy will be in Spain. So they're calling out for NGOs to come together and propose something from civil society organizations. So I think I would like to know what Lopa think of feminist diplomacy, because as you have said, not everybody always agreed, and indeed not everybody agrees on the term feminist diplomacy. So there are already 5 countries who are members of this feminist diplomacy. I attended the last event in Paris last year in June. And so I'm also in contact with Spain. So thank you very much for your answer.
Thank you so much, Marie-Claude. Yes, you're referring to the Feminist Foreign Policy Initiative, which is there for across a number of different countries, and both from the global north, global south, a number of different countries that have come forward, and indeed. And there's also the Feminist Foreign Policy Collective, which is also a collection of civil society. Now, I don't want to get into the terminology. Some countries adopt the term feminist, some other countries don't, but the objective, what is the objective? And I think that's what's really important. The objective here is to be able to use foreign policy, because foreign policy is the ways in which one nation engages with the other in a global space. It's a nation's fundamental governance modality in terms of engaging with another nation in the global space. And that's what we're all talking about the global space right now. So using foreign policy to be able to push for gender equality. This goes back to that point around, it's the answer to transactionalism, because it's the other side of transactionalism, where states are transacting on specific aspects that support their national agendas and their national political agendas. So this then becomes the way in which activists, advocates, and those within governments, because even when a government is has a certain political perspective that may or may not be upholding rights in their full comprehensiveness, there are people within those institutions. Within governments are not monolithic. There are people within governments that continue to uphold rights and push for it. So feminist foreign policy, or foreign policy that supports gender equality as a deliverable of engagement from one nation to another, is crucial. And that's what the role and goal of the work that is happening around feminist foreign policy is. Of course, there are a lot of discussions and issues around whether it is actually delivering. One of the main goals around the feminist movements and gender equality agenda is peace. And the inability of many of the countries that have got feminist foreign policies to be actually able, have been engaging in war, or who have been supportive, or who have not been able to effect peace. And there has been a lot of critiques around that. But that said, I think the idea of using foreign policy as a means to push for gender equality, whether in political participation, whether in economic justice and rights, whether around different aspects of trade and migration and equality is really important. And so fully agree with what you're saying. I think it's a very important space. I think it's an important space for various civil society actors to engage in. It's not a space where lots of civil society are engaging in. Certain groups of people are, but it's certainly a really important space because ultimately, at the UN, for example, yes, at CSW, there are gender ministries and machineries that come, but ultimately the decision making and the negotiations are done by foreign policy diplomats. And so it's really important to be able to engage in this space a lot more tactically and strategically.
Okay, I'm going to have to say we're starting. I have to be mindful of the time and the clock. So I'm going to ask that the next. We'll take one more question. So can you make it very short, Anita? Maybe you go next.
Yes, this is not a question. There is a question, but I'm just going to share a couple of points. When you're talking about the U.S. Women's Caucus and power to really mobilize in the U.S., similar to that of the CEDAW, it'll be very important to see if we can get ILOC 190 convention at the state level. Like some of the priorities being implemented at the state level will be very crucial. You mentioned that you are U.S. based, but many of your members have international presence, so it'll be important to use that leverage really to make momentum on the ground. A second point is, keep very close watch of the financing for development process. It's happening in April, and the Sevilla outcome document came out. In that, gender equality, gender responsive budgeting, all that are stated very heavily, very importantly highlighted. So it's important to keep track of those recommendations, because if we just sit in CSW and say CSW is all that matters, and if we don't look at other areas and the intersectionalities of all the work we do, then we can really move the needle for women, right? So it's important that we sort of collectively collaborate to see where can we make the most movement. I think Lopa gave a lot of recommendations on mission visits, collaborating with missions, but it's the same member states we are dealing with across the board, right? And so maybe we can bring it into all the various forums that we are addressing. But Lopa, just a quick question. What is the key priorities for UN Women with regard to Sevilla outcome document? What are you looking at, that where allocation is most needed?
In the interest of time, I'm going to suggest, we had our key proposal that came out, policy paper that we released last year, and that actually informed the Sevilla outcome document. And we are just following up on a set of actions around that, specifically around the aspects around social protection, as well as ending violence in the workplace, but also around green and blue jobs around that, and in terms of an inclusive labor force, with particular attention to marginalized groups, including those in the informal sector, and of course the focus around looking at a larger financial and policy focus on the care economy and its links with development.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we're going to have to end at that point. I'm sorry. I know that we have more questions that are on the phone, but we have two of the speakers who are going to have to leave because they have to get to other appointments. And we need to appreciate their time. So thank you very much again for all of our panelists today for providing lots of great discussion ideas. You all have difficult jobs ahead of you. So we wish you luck on that. And I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors for the program, though, today, Lois Herman from the Women's UN Report Network, Shaila Mistry from the STEM Institute, the International Alliance of Women, and of course, Renee Kobach, who has been doing our video hookup on this program. The U.S. Women's Caucus will continue to provide up-to-date information on what's happening at the UN as best we can. If you're not a member of our organization, please consider joining us. The information can be found at uswomenscaucus.org. And I thank you all for your interest, your continued support, and let's all try to navigate this thing together in the difficult waters ahead. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you.